The normality in our society is that people are disconnected from who they are. The consumer culture and the culture of people influencing each other, it's all part of a culture of disconnection. The reason so many people are suffering physical and mental illness, it all comes from this disconnection from our nature. These so-called mentally ill behaviors, they all serve a function, dealing with the trauma that has not been addressed. Are we aware? Are we conscious? Are we making deliberate choices? Or are we driven by unconscious pain? Which kind of pain would you rather be in? The pain of self-suppression or the pain of losing some attachments?
Do you see a divine design within our wounding?
There's something about our nature. There's a kind of intelligence in it that wants us to be authentic to ourselves. People need freedom. Freedom politically, freedom economically, freedom socially, freedom from their unconscious emotions so they can be themselves. And that's, I think, the essential endeavor of all the great work that has been done in the world, is the desire for freedom.
Hello, beautiful humans. Welcome back to the Know Thyself podcast, where every single week we get the honor and privilege to sit down with a brilliant mind and open heart to see how we can learn more about ourselves and the world around us. Today is part 2 of an incredible conversation and dialogue that is very needed right now on the planet. My guest today is Dr. Gabor Maté. As you may know, he is an expert on a range of topics and has been speaking and writing books for many years on stress, addiction, childhood development, the implications of trauma on culture. And he's written multiple best-selling books, such as In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts, When the Body Says No, Scattered Minds, just to name a few. And his new book, The Myth of Normal, which I absolutely adore and is available now, that you can all go check out in the link below in the description, is bringing up a very timely subject for our species as a humanity and where we are and how we got to the point where we are now, how disconnected we've become with nature. So again, last night we had a live community kind of podcast and the conversation was really beautiful. Everyone was so touched. Thank you for coming in the studio to do a follow-up.
Well, it's great to be back again.
Yeah, so good. So I thought we'd just start because I really love this quote in the beginning of the book, which is from Erich Fromm. And it says, "The fact that millions of people share the same vices does not make these vices virtues. The fact that they share so many errors does not make the errors to be truths. And the fact that millions of people share the same forms of mental pathology does not make these people sane."
Yeah.
I think it's a beautiful way to open up our dialogue today because, and if you would share your overview of how unnatural our normal as a society has become.
The quote is from Erich Fromm, who was a great psychologist in the first half of the 20th century, originally from Germany and settled in the United States. He wrote a book around the mid-century called The Sane Society, which already he was pointing out, this is 3/4 of a century ago now, he was already pointing out that in the most advanced societies, there's a greater preponderance of mental illness. And so when you said in your introduction, Andre, that I wrote this book about our disconnection from nature, it's primarily about a disconnection from our own nature as human beings. And the normality in our society is that people are disconnected from who they are. And the consumer culture and the culture of fame and the culture of momentary attention and the culture of people influencing each other in engaging in totally meaningless activities. It's all part of a culture of disconnection. And so that the reason so many people are suffering physical and mental illness, 70% of American adults are taking at least one medication. 70%. So on the one hand, we have this richest society in the history of the world. On the other hand, you have a large percentage of the population who got health issues of mind or body or both. It all comes from this disconnection from our nature. And so that's the biggest normality, quote unquote, of our culture. And so when Fromm says that just because a whole lot of people buy into something, that doesn't make it normal or sane. Basically, they have taken that and updated it to our present time. But I'm riffing on the themes that he raised all those years ago.
Yeah, and you in this book so eloquently dive into all the different ways in which toxicity has become normalized in the far-reaching corners of our culture. And you also share, I love that, in Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, individuals are so conditioned that they practically can't help behaving as they ought to behave.
Yeah.
And you give these character traits that I think are really beautiful that I'll kind of just briefly mention here because it's very descriptive of the place that we've gotten to individually and collectively. So you give 3. The first character trait is separation from self. And I'll just read a quote here. In an image-mad culture that sustains itself in large part by making people feel inadequate about themselves, or more insidiously capitalizing on these pre-existing feelings, the media holds out ideals of physical perfection against which young and old measure themselves and which lead people to be ashamed of their very bodies. And that is descriptive to the separation from self for the character trait number 1. The second one is the character trait of consumption hunger.
Yeah.
And just briefly, I love this part here. You say, what the advertisers need to know is not what is right about the product, but what is wrong about the buyer.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the third is hypnotic passivity. And it's this hypnotic state that we've, I believe, gotten to in a culture. And you share, it is we who are made in the image of our distorted, disordered, denatured world, the better keep it running, even as it runs us into the ground. So you give beautiful descriptions as to how we've taken on these character traits, but also how culture, society, social media, the news, advertisers feed on this.
Yeah.
So
Eric Fromm, who we began quoting, talked about the social character. And the social character is the personality traits that a society would seek to inculcate in its members in order to keep itself going. I've sort of updated that. Now, in Huxley's Brave New World, people are literally gestated in a test tube, and they're biochemically and environmentally trained and developed to fulfill certain roles and to be happy with those roles. Now, we're not gestated in test tubes, and we're not mechanically programmed like that, but almost like we were. Because as Huxley points out in The Brave New World, the thing is to want to do what society expects you to do. So that what we end up wanting to do has got nothing to do with our own particular needs or true nature. It has to do with what the society expects of us. So these 3 traits. So we're not programmed like in Brave New World, but Huxley wrote that Brave New World not as some kind of a fantasy. He wrote it because this is where he saw society going. And it's only become more acute since he wrote that book in the 30s, I think.
Yeah.
And since Eric Fromm wrote and spoke in the mid 20th century. So these character traits of disconnection from ourselves, this society needs us to be disconnected from ourselves. Otherwise, we wouldn't elect the politicians that we elect. If we're connected to our gut feelings, there's a very interesting story about Ronald Reagan. Oliver Sacks, who was a British-American neurologist and writer, he wrote The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat and other very famous books. And he worked with neurologically challenged patients. And he describes an experience that he witnessed on a ward where there were patients who were aphasiac. That means they had a stroke, they lost their capacity for processing language. They're called aphasics. These aphasic patients, as a group, are watching Ronald Reagan, the president, on television, and most of them are laughing, and some of them are outraged. And Sachs asks himself, is it that they don't understand Reagan, or is it that they understand him all too well? And what it was is these people could not be mesmerized by the words because they didn't understand the words. They're reading his body language. And they read that he was a complete phony. And why was Reagan a phony? Because, not that he intended to be, but because he was a traumatized child whose father was a heavy alcoholic, and Reagan developed this Teflon, non-involved, emotionally distant, inauthentic persona as a way of surviving his childhood. In this insane world, that above it reassuring presence was seen as a political strength. And these aphasiacs who didn't buy into the words, they just saw the real person, they didn't buy it for a minute. So what I'm saying is that if we were connected to our gut feelings, there's a lot of things we wouldn't be choosing. A lot of things we wouldn't buy that we don't need. A lot of people we wouldn't follow who are actually not authentic themselves. So the big way that society survives is by people disconnected from their gut feelings. So that's what I mean by it's an essential part of our social character is to be disconnected from ourselves. And the society wants us to be disconnected.
Right. Because it keeps the machine going. It's
Yeah.
very much so. And the way you describe it, it's almost like I think of the Matrix less like a movie and more like a documentary showing
Well, exactly.
exactly how plugged into the system we are, into the Matrix. And it's like a very real thing. There's this hypnotic rhythm in which people don't even realize they're in, much like the Matrix, that feed into the system that supports people at the top, people, the oligarchy of America that it has become. And so is there anything that you want to speak to, just like how the mass hypnosis continues to propagate and how we can start to dismantle that?
Well, interesting you mentioned the Matrix because I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure that I've heard the story that the people that wrote the Matrix did so after they took part in a self-awareness program, which I won't mention, but they did, so that they could see all of a sudden the gap between how they lived and the reality, Well, look, mass hypnosis. Let's take something simple. Let's take America's wars. Since the 1970s, America's been involved in several wars. Each time there's a war, sooner or later it transpires that it was based on a pack of lies. And this is true in American history. The Mexican-American War was based on a pack of lies. The Spanish-American War was based on a pack of lies. The Vietnam War. And all these things were documented. It's not even controversial anymore. But at the time, everybody bought into it. Now, anybody who'd done the research at the time would have known right away that they were being fed lies. And despite the fact that, or say the lie about the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, which never existed, anybody with eyes in their heads knew that that was a manipulation and it wasn't true. The result was that thousands of Americans and 500,000 Iraqis died. Now, despite the fact that each time the lies are exposed, when the next war comes along, everybody still goes along with it. Well, that's mass hypnosis. It's like there's all this history. And if you take the average American, ask them to string together 2 intelligent sentences about the history of Afghanistan, they couldn't tell you anything. The Ukraine war right now, without going to the politics of it, ask the average American to give you 2 sentences on the history of Ukraine, 2 intelligent consecutive sentences on the history of Ukraine. That didn't start last year, but it's still going back into history. They couldn't. And yet, they get swept along every time into the narrative. And I'm only talking about these wars. I could talk about any number of political issues. It takes a kind of a passivity. Or take an issue that surely affects us all, climate change. We're talking today, this is January the 16th, I think. Today there's another article about Greenland, about how the ice mass of Greenland is melting at a faster rate than it has for over a millennium. Now, we all see it happening, but we're all totally passive in the face of it. It takes a hypnotic state of passivity. I mean, we're actually seeing the earth changing because of our own activities. Nobody denies that except people in utter emotional denial states, or unless you work for an oil company where it's your job to deny it. But nobody else can ignore what's going on. But you and I, we live our lives as if it wasn't happening. Well, that's a state of hypnotic passivity. And so this society, of course, thrives on that, because we get to be led into foreign policy adventures or economic policies that are turned out to be ultimately harmful. But we were, I don't even say willing participants, but we're passive participants. And I could go on, but there's a kind of passivity about us. And it's that passivity that allows advertisers to beam programs into our homes and into our machines that addict our infants. Our infants are getting addicted to technology. You can see it on brain scans. You can see it in their behavior. Would you allow drug dealers into your house to inject heroin into your infants? But we're allowing it. So that takes a tremendous amount of passivity.
Yeah, it's like a mass psychosis that has become so normalized and just
Yeah.
accepted as just the status quo, just carry on as business as usual. And there's a part of my time, like, 6, 7 years ago, when I got very much so into seeing this and waking
Yeah.
up to this. And I think it's important to become aware of what's happening on a global scale, but then also reclaiming the personal responsibility to see, where am I still asleep in my own life, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And bringing that back home within ourselves, because that's ultimately the only thing we have control over. So is there anything you want to speak to into inviting people just to try, before trying to wake up the world and liberate the world, we got to start where our feet are?
Well, sure. And I was speaking just a few days ago with this wonderful Buddhist meditation teacher, Tara Brach, and she talks about the trance that we're all in. So, the trance is when we're not aware that we're there, that we're not aware of ourselves. We're just sort of automatically carrying on with something. And, there I am at my hotel room last night, toggling from one YouTube video to another. And all of a sudden, I'm in a trance. What am I doing? Not doing anything useful. I'm not even doing anything that entertaining. I'm just an automatic pilot. So you're totally right. And we all find ourselves in this trance much of the time, lacking aware of our bodies and our minds and what our life intentions are. I mean, I tell you, I hate the idea of being on my deathbed and looking at it. I'm like, what did I do with all that time?
Yeah.
Even now,
Yeah.
So, so that waking up and not taking responsibility is a daily task. Again, this culture tends to lull us. It's designed to lull us to sleep all the time. With Thomas Merton, who's a Catholic monk, also and a mystic, and he also lived in mid 20th century, and in his autobiography called The Seven-Story Mountain, he talks about that this whole society is designed to lull us to sleep with our products and our Hollywood films and everything else to keep us in a state of passivity.
Yeah, controlled.
Yeah.
Controlled.
Yeah. So and of course, wittingly or unwittingly, we get to be willing participants in this mass hypnosis.
Yeah. And it doesn't make it easier that, for example, with social media, that algorithms are literally meant to keep us as engaged with the least amount of effort, that we can just sit there and they'll even do the scrolling for us now. We just have to stare at the screen and keep getting dopamine.
Yeah, well, and those devices are designed with addictive blandishments in mind. They're designed to keep. There's a company called Dopamine Lab, which helps design programs for cell phones. For God, dopamine is a chemical that we need for life, but when we don't generate it through meaningful activity, we get hooked into false activities that spike our dopamine for us, and it's a very deliberate attempt. It's not. They call it neuromarketing. They're actually marketing stuff to get our nervous system hooked, and we participate in it.
Yeah, I want to touch on how oftentimes the society around us will capitalize, right? Before our minds make the environment makes us, right?
Yeah.
And who we are as individuals when we come into the world, we are these, some might say we're connected to our true nature in this blank state. But I actually want to touch on and ask you about intergenerational trauma, because of course, we have the traumas that we've occurred in this lifetime, but also as a species, as a culture, as a people, African Americans, Middle Easterns, we all have our own individuation of trauma that is within our bloodline. And how do you see that stored in the unconscious? Because let's say I'm in my 20s and 30s and I have I have some sort of repression of emotion or something that I can't necessarily point to an event that happened in my life, and maybe it didn't happen in this life. But how do you see it? Is everything just coming from this life, or is it essentially the genes and how they impress upon us?
Well, some people believe in past lives. Even my mind has never been able to go there. I usually find it sufficient to look at a person's life in this temporal state and find enough reasons for why they are the way they are. That doesn't mean that past generations don't come into it. But what I am saying is that the effect of past generations is passed on to us in this lifetime.
Yeah.
So in Canada, there's a terrible history of our native people being horribly abused by the state. Their children were abducted for 100 years and sent to terrible residential schools where they were sexually, emotionally, and physically abused, and many of them died at the hands of the church and the state. It so happens that our Indigenous Canadians also make up a large percentage of our prison population. They have much higher rates of addiction, suicide, mental health issues, physical illnesses that they never used to have before colonization. And unfortunately, and whereas they used to parent in a much healthier way than so-called advanced societies parent, they really knew how to parent. Hold kids, support them, give them an environment that reared them to be confident, self-assured, socially connected human beings. They knew how to do it. They were much closer to our nature. That's been largely extirpated. As a result, now they abuse their kids. So each generation then passes on its trauma to the next. So in a lot of Native communities, it's almost impossible to find young girls by the time they're teenagers who had not been sexually abused. Now that's the impact of the past, but it's being exerted in this particular lifetime. Then you have what's called epigenetic transmission, which means that the way the genes function, if one generation is traumatized, that alters not the gene structure, but the genetic functioning. And that genetic functioning can be passed on to future generations. That's a new science. I don't think we fully know yet how strong those epigenetic effects are. It's an emerging field. There's been some very interesting research. But in general, and certainly it's already true that when a mother carries an infant, the stresses and traumas that she is burdened with can affect the developing brain and personality of the child already in the womb already. So yes, the experience, and as a Jew, I can tell you that the traumas of previous generations certainly have an impact on, as a part Palestinian, you know the same thing.
Yeah.
And in fact, there's been an unfortunate set of circumstances that have, in my view, imposed the trauma of one people onto another people.
We're here today.
Yeah.
in loving embrace.
Yeah. So the past trauma does happen, and Eckhart Tolle, the spiritual teacher, talks about the pain body, which is really our accumulated traumas that affect us. And he talks about the pain body can exist on a social and historical level as well.
Yeah.
So women, because of the persecution of women, the witch hunts, the oppression of women, the rape, and so on, women carry that pain body, and certain peoples carry a heavier pain body than other peoples. So yeah, it's all multi-generational, it's all historical, and I think that the effects are always exerted in this particular lifetime.
Yeah, absolutely. I think in the middle part of the book, you give so many examples of how the trauma that we store within us lead to the manifestations of illness. For example, racism leading to asthma, or even within culturally, how African Americans deal with hypertension more frequently, and how sometimes we just look at the diagnosis of whatever the disease is and think that that's it. But like, there's all these psychosomatic, emotional elements that we just are not aware of that are often the real reason for why we have the manifestation of a disease or a diagnosis. So is
Yeah.
there anything you want to speak to there? Because I thought it was so fascinating, and all the examples from
Yeah.
gender to race to the different things that we hold within us that create the illness.
Sure. So this is where my profession, the medical profession, is so remiss in its duties, because we have the science now. I mean, we have the science elegantly delineated, showing the unity of mind and body, showing how emotions affect physiology, which also means that our relationships affect physiology, because our relationships program our emotions. So when there's a study that shows that parents who are very stressed, their kids are more likely to have asthma, it's because the stresses of the parents affect the physiology of the child. That's been known for decades. It's not even controversial. And yet, you go to the average physician with asthma, they'll never talk to you about stress. They'll just give you inhalers, which is necessary but not sufficient to deal with the issue. Same way, there's been a study that showed that the more experiences of racism a Black American woman has to endure, the greater risk for asthma. Now, the physiology is very simple. I'm not going to go into it here, but it's very simple. It's very straightforward, not even controversial. And how do we treat asthma, by the way? You know how we treat it? We give people stress hormones. We give adrenaline and cortisol in the form of injections or inhalers. Should we maybe ask ourselves, gosh, we're treating it with stress hormones? Does stress have something to do with it, maybe? As a matter of fact, if one asks oneself, which medications are used most commonly across the board? If you come in with inflammation of the intestines, as in colitis, or the joints, as in rheumatoid arthritis, or the skin, as in eczema or psoriasis, or the nervous system, as in multiple sclerosis, or the lungs, what do we give people? We give people steroids. What are steroids? They're the stress hormones that our adrenal gland manufactures. Maybe we should see that there's a connection between stress and all these conditions, and there is. So, great pioneers of medicine, who I won't name now, but they're in the book, in the 19th century already identified that multiple sclerosis, rheumatoid arthritis, and breast cancer were related to stress. They had no science then. They were just giants of medicine with tremendous insight. Since then, there's been 100 years of research showing the relationship between, say, stress, trauma, and rheumatoid arthritis. And there's women, by the way, who develop 70 or 80% of autoimmune diseases. Nobody understands why. Well, they just happen to be the stress absorbers of their whole families and of their men as well. That's why they have more stress-related conditions such as rheumatoid arthritis, much more. It's also simple, it's also straightforward, and it's also scientific. To go back to Black Americans and hypertension, they have a high risk, Black American men have a higher risk of high blood pressure, hypertension it's called. Their genetic relatives in Africa don't. It's not genetic. So what is it? Well, let's do a simple linguistic exercise. Take the word hypertension and split it. Hypertension, hypertension. Oh, too much tension. Black American kids already have higher blood pressure than white kids. And why? Because of the stress of racism. And just to conclude this, a wonderful American physician called George Engel, back in 1972, called for what he termed a biopsychosocial view of medicine, which is to recognize that our biology is inseparable from our psychology, which is inseparable from our social relationships. We are biopsychosocial creatures. And all those influences determine our health or our illness.
Once you see it, it's like obvious, right?
Yeah.
Do you feel like the medical professionals is just it's a problem of ignorance, or is it really malevolent intent from higher up corporations that, obviously profit from the ongoing cycles of not creating cures, but keeping customers?
Well, it is true that pharmaceutical companies want to create products that people will have to take for a long time, So they're not particularly interested in cures, but they don't even have that vision. But what makes the medical, and there's lots of examples of chicanery in the pharmaceutical industry where drugs are promoted as much more effective than they really are, or the side effects that are known are kind of denied or diminished. So they're not above as any profit-making entity. Their bottom line is profit. Ethics is not high on the list. They're not unique in that. Airline industry, the automaking industry, the fossil fuel industry, the food industry, the entertainment industry. Ethics isn't, corporate ethics is kind of like a oxymoron, like military intelligence, the two don't go together.
Like you say in the book, it's not like they're trying to kill people. They're just trying to make money. And if they kill people, it's just like a
they're not trying to kill you. They just don't care if you die. Like they'll sell you junk foods knowing how harmful they are.
Yeah.
They're not trying to kill you. They're just trying to make money. But they don't care if you die. They don't care. Now, but what makes a medical profession so susceptible to that kind of pressure? That's not the fault of the pharmaceutical companies. That has to do with both the ignorance and the arrogance of the medical profession. The ignorance comes in not looking at the science that I've been referring to, not looking at the studies linking multiple sclerosis and stress and trauma, plenty of them, not looking at the physiology of how trauma inflames the nervous system, not looking at the physiology of how people traumatized in childhood carry higher markers, inflammatory chemicals in their bloodstream. It's all there. Not looking at how trauma and stress in childhood affects the functioning of one's chromosomes. I mean, the science is there. So there's a kind of ignorance there. The arrogance is in assuming that doctors don't think they know everything, but the arrogance comes into thinking that what they don't know is not worth knowing. So wisdom of indigenous people, for example, which has shown the mind-body unity forever, not shown it, recognized it. Modern science has shown it. Indigenous wisdom has always maintained it. So what I'm saying to you about the biopsychosocial nature of human beings and illness, that's not news to any indigenous healer. Our arrogance is in dismissing the wisdom of other peoples and of human tradition. Our science is amazing. Nobody can deny its achievements. Nobody can. It's miraculous what modern medicine can do. It's also very limited. And the arrogance is in not recognizing the limitations.
The degree in which we experience joy and suffering in our life oftentimes comes in, depending upon the constitution of our personality. You said that if a parent doesn't know how to hold a child will develop a mind to hold itself, right?
Yeah, that came from a therapist.
Great.
Yeah.
And so the minds that we develop to hold ourselves become the colored tinted glasses in which we view the world. And like we spoke to earlier with the reference to the medical industry, it's like if we see a problem or we see a leaf on a tree that has turned brown or a fruit that isn't, it's like the solution oftentimes is to paint over the fruit with the color red paint instead of treating the root and giving the nutrients to the soil. Likewise, as an individual within our own nature, if we have come to this withered, crippled place within our own psyche, because of the personality that we've developed, I just would love for you to share how we can, one, gain awareness on what the personality is, and then how inextricably connected it is to the amount of suffering and joy that we have.
Yeah. So we talk about, for example, a winning personality. What is the personality winning? It's winning approval and admiration of others. Why does somebody have to win that? Why is somebody compelled to win that? Because they didn't have it. They didn't have the acceptance and the admiration just for who they are in their early childhood. So they develop this winning personality until they get depressed because they weren't being their true self. We get people who are very nice, very nice. I worry about the very nice people because that niceness is very often a personality trait in which they actually repress their healthy aggression, their healthy capacity to set boundaries and to express healthy anger when somebody's transgressing, and they take on the needs of others. So that everybody thinks that they're so nice. And when they go to their funeral, how nice they were. And that niceness is what killed them, because that niceness reflected a repression of their healthy anger, you know. So the personality is not who we are. And the problem is, and this is, of course, a spiritual teaching that goes way back to ancient India, at least, that the personality that we develop is not actually the essential ourselves. So modern psychology has beautifully studied and depicted how the personality develops. And the personality develops in interaction with the environment. And basically, kids will develop traits that will help them fit in with the environment. If the environment doesn't accept them for who they actually are, then we develop these personality traits that are designed to make us acceptable. So I'll be charming, I'll be winning personality, I'll be very nice, or I'll be very consumed by being attractive so I can attract attention. To me, this very sad phenomena of people as they age, desperately trying to look younger because they're so identified with their attractiveness. Who am I if I'm not being attractive? But that's a function of their childhood programming reinforced by cultural conditioning. So you have the multi-billion-dollar cosmetic surgery industry. Article in Time magazine today about science is discovering the ways to reverse aging. We just can't accept the reality that we get old. You know what? It's all going to lead nowhere. Because there's such a thing as nature. You know? And the wisdom isn't how to get around nature, is how to align with it. You know, but we don't, in this society, it doesn't get that at all. There's a way of getting old, aging physically, without aging in our essential self and in our minds. You know, so that you can be a very youthful 90-year-old, or you can be a very old 45-year-old. You know, and it's all has to do with internal dynamics. So I'm not even sure what question I'm answering anymore. I'm sure it's a good answer, but I don't know to what.
It was a great answer. And I think it's just important to interlay how the personalities we develop then
right.
become deleterious, obviously, within our experience in ways we're not aware of, that lead to addictions that we can't seem to resolve, right? And you said, don't ask why the addiction, why the pain.
Yeah.
The pains that we hold oftentimes were the origins of the personality being developed in the first place, that persona that we develop, which is a mask.
Yeah.
That is the barrier between us and the wound. So like serves as the protection mechanism as it did earlier in our childhood, but then it also becomes the barrier to joy as we age.
Absolutely. And you said it very succinctly. Well, to give you a personal example. So as a physician, I was a workaholic doctor. Now, I genuinely wanted to serve people. So wanting to serve humanity wasn't any kind of a false personality trait. It was genuinely expressive of who I am, as of many of my colleagues. But it doesn't operate on its own. It operates in a context, in conjunction with other dynamics that are not so pure. So one dynamic that certainly I could own to is I really believe that if I go to medical school, I'll have respect. Finally, they'll respect me. Well, why do they even need that? Because they didn't respect myself. So I had to have a stethoscope and the white coat. Now I'm somebody. So there's that. Not so healthy. But even more subtle is the need to be needed, the need to be wanted. As an infant, for reasons I won't go into now, but it's explained in the book, I got the message as an infant that I wasn't wanted. That's how I interpreted the world's actions. I wasn't wanted. Now, if you're not wanted, medical school is a great way to make yourself wanted, because you're offering something very important to people, and when they're in crisis, they want you all the time. Very addictive. because there's a hole inside you where you should be, and you're trying to fill it all the time from what you get from the outside. So it's never enough. So the more you get, the more you want.
Mhm.
That's the nature of any addiction.
Mm.
So therefore, I'm addicted to working. Well, that kills joy. It also makes me absent as a parent to my children, and makes me absent as a partner in my marriage, which also is not a joy enhancer. Exactly, you know. And so this trait of working hard for others, and the world admires it. And the more workaholic a physician I am, the more the world thinks I'm wonderful, and the more money I make. So I get all this reinforcement for my disconnection from myself. And then you couple that with the fact that I really wanted to help people.
Mm.
It gets so confusing. And the thing is to separate what's genuine in that, which is the desire to be of service and to engage in meaningful activity, and to separate that from the need to fill a hole in myself. This is hard work.
Yeah.
And in society, again, it seduces us into that disconnection and even rewards it.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Like we spoke to earlier. In the book, you share a comedian, Daryl Hammond, said to you that cutting himself
Yeah.
afforded him a crisis that's more manageable than the terror inside of you.
Yeah.
The one that's ongoing in your head.
Yeah. Now, Hammond is an interesting example. There's a documentary about him called Cracked Up, which is on Netflix. And then I spoke to him after the documentary, and he had decades of mental illness, so-called, multiple medications and diagnoses of about 30 or 40 psychiatrists. They all tried to figure out what's wrong with his brain, give him the right medication, until a psychiatrist finally said to him, I don't want to call what you've got an illness. You've been abused. And he was in childhood. That's what the documentary is about. And so the self-cutting is one manifestation of his so-called mental illness.
Yeah.
And anybody who cuts themselves, when I speak with them, my question is not always what's wrong with this behavior, but what's right about it. What's it doing for you? Now, anybody who self-cuts, and I give several examples, Daryl being one of them, is that cutting serves a purpose. Of first of all, it gives them a pain they can identify, as opposed to this searing emotional pain that's just so confusing and so threatening. It gives Daryl a crisis he can handle. Now he has to run around finding bandages and dealing with the cut, as opposed to the chaos in his head, the crisis that he can't handle. Self-cutting also releases the body's own painkillers, the endorphins.
Mm.
So you temporarily actually might even feel better.
Like numb it a little bit.
Yeah. So the point of the Daryl Hammond incident or episode is to show that these mental health, these so-called mentally ill behaviors, they all serve a function. And that function has to do with dealing with the trauma that has not been addressed. And Hammond is a very forthright, self-disclosing example of that. So there he is on the one hand. He appears on Saturday Night Live more than anybody else. And he's a brilliant comedian, getting all these accolades and making a lot of money. And just tormented inside. Until finally says to him, there's a reason for that torment. You're not crazy.
Mm. Yeah, so beautifully put. I think, you shared as well, like it's never the thing, right? It's not the heroin, it's not the whiskey, it's not the social media. It's always our relationship to it.
That's right.
Because somebody could have a completely healthy relationship with a plant medicine, with their phone. So it's always a relationship to it. And so how do you...
Or even a glass of wine. Or,
right.
Whatever, yeah.
Yeah, I guess what is the distinction there in somebody that has a healthy relationship versus not, and how does that manifest in our life?
In a healthy relationship with any behavior, whether it's to do with, say, a glass of wine, or your work, or your sexuality, or your relationship, or how you relate to food, clearly we can have a healthy relationship with food. In fact, we have to. But we can also have a dysfunctional relationship to food. that could threaten our health. The key question is, are we aware? Are we conscious? Are we making deliberate choices? Or are we driven by unconscious pain? And so the unhealthy relationship is always driven by unconscious pain. So if I get into a relationship because I'm looking for a life partner with whom I can grow and whom I can cherish and feel cherished by, even if it takes several relationships to get there, that's just healthy human behavior. If I'm engaging in relationships because I need validation and I need somebody to prove to me that I'm lovable, or because I need to dominate somebody, or perhaps get some comfort in feeling dominated, and so I'm driven to do it, then it's unhealthy. Same with food.
Yeah.
If I'm eating to enjoy it consciously and to nourish my body, that's great. But if I'm doing it to soothe my pain, if I'm eating junk food to release the endorphins in my brain so I can temporarily feel better, if I'm using it to stuff down my pain, literally you're stuffing down your pain by stuffing down the food, if that's why I'm doing it, it's unhealthy. So it's not the activity per se, it's one's internal relationship to it. That defines whether it's healthy or addictive. And the key question is, are you craving it? Does it give you temporary pleasure but cause harm in the long term? If yes, it's not a healthy relationship.
Yeah. It's almost just like if we going into a behavior, whatever it is that could be addictive or not addictive based on our relationship to it, is if we're going in it from the experience of joy rather than the seeking of joy, and the temporary relief from the self, which is necessary in the addictive behavior, right? There's like, Jung has that saying that pleasure is tension reduction. And I think that's just very apt there, because it's these external addictions, or whether it's more visceral, like, self-harm, or a relationship that we have to a drug, or, pornography, or whatever it might be, it's giving us temporary relief from the pain that we can't seem to bear.
Yeah. Well, and that's my definition of addiction, is any behavior that gives us temporary pleasure or relief, and therefore we crave it, but then it creates harm in the long term and we can't give it up. That's what an addiction is. So that could be anything. Gambling, sports, eating, shopping, work, relationships, pornography, food, internet, of course, anything.
Yeah.
Anything. Or we could do any of those things. Well, not pornography, but we could do more. We could be interested in sexuality without it being unhealthy, without that being in any way unhealthy. In fact, it being a very healthy expression of who we are. It all has to do with our relationship to it.
Yeah. It just feels like the relationship to how we relate to just about everything in our reality is like the most important to pay attention and gain awareness on, because that's how we relate. That's how we commune with the world around us, is in the relation that we have to it. What is your distinction between like the Buddhist view of non-attachment, but then also expressing our emotions in a healthy way? So we can see the illusory nature of whatever is happening. We can see the content of our experience in a larger context of awareness, yet we do have the very real experience of being a human with our shit. And so how has it been, either for you on your journey, and how you support people to be non-attached, but then also be very authentic to your real-time experience?
The word attachment, it's interesting because it's got two uses. When the Buddha talked about attachment, he talked about an unhealthy craving and holding on to mind patterns or behaviors or objects or anything. So we're too attached. So letting go of attachment. Non-attachment is kind of a Buddhist ideal. Is that we don't look to the outside to fulfill us. That's really what non-attachment is about. It's one thing for me to want my book to do well. It's another thing for me to be attached to the book doing well, so that how the book is doing then determines how I'm doing.
Yeah.
Not a healthy attachment.
Right.
But then we use the word attachment in modern psychology in a totally different way.
Yeah.
Where attachment actually is this relationship between parent and child.
Yeah.
Connection. and it's essential. So all mammals are creatures of attachment. No mammal would survive without attachment relationship with the nurturing environment, where the attachment is a drive that pulls the parent towards the child and the child towards the parent, or the drive that pulls two adults together, like it's a gravitational force that pulls two bodies together in order to procreate children, or to live in community, So attachment, in that sense, is a healthy human drive. Here's the kicker: those people that don't get their healthy attachment needs met in childhood will become attached in the Buddhist sense to externals, because they haven't got the internal fulfillment and connection to themselves. Now they have to get it from the outside. So the lack of attachment in the healthy sense leads to that attachment in the unhealthy sense.
That's a very powerful distinction, because we're going to create all these coping mechanisms and behavioral compensations if we don't get our basic fundamental needs yet, which we spoke to in the previous live podcast. So in the pursuit of expressing our emotions in a healthy way, what is a healthy expression of our emotions if we're not to suppress it or repress it or express it in a way that is dangerous or harmful to those around us? How do we release what is inside of us? And somebody you quote in the book, what's in must out.
Yeah. Well, what is in us must out. In this case, the physician researcher who said that was talking about our creative urges. If something is inside us, we have to give it expression. Otherwise, we'll choke. He said,
Which I'd love to go there as well. But then also there's these emotions too.
Well, so one of the essential needs of children, one of the essential developmental needs of children, in the absence of which child development is distorted, is the freedom to express all their emotions. Now, in our brains, there are certain emotional circuits. We're wired for them. They include anger, lust, curiosity, playfulness, caring for others, fear, grief, even panic. We're wired for these. We share these circuits, by the way, with other mammals. The child, in the course of their development, will experience all of them. They have to be able to express it, and to have that expression received, understood, attuned with, and held by the adult world. When that doesn't happen, we start stuffing our emotions. We start disconnecting from ourselves in order to belong, in order to be accepted, to be acceptable. So then we don't know how to express healthy anger anymore. Healthy anger, there's nothing negative about it. Healthy anger simply says, you're in my space, get out. All animals have it. You enter an animal space, you get an anger display. Which is good because it prevents violence. So at least it reduces the chances of it. It's a boundary defense. That's all it is. You're in my space, get out. Whether that's physically or emotionally true. No. Healthy anger is simply a no, which at the same time is a saying yes to yourself. When people are not granted the experience of going through healthy anger, having that understood and respected by adults, they suppress it. Now it'll burst out of them in a volcano. Either they totally repress it, in which case they become sitting ducks for malignancy or autoimmune disease, because those are the studied traits of people who develop these conditions. I don't make this stuff up. I've seen it, but I don't make it up. Or they get into states of explosive anger, which is like a volcano where the pressure's been building and building and building, and all of a sudden the volcano blows its top. And so the question, if I can translate your question, is if in childhood we were made to repress that healthy anger, how then do we learn its expression as adults?
Yes.
Well, that's a question of good therapy, I think. You know.
Yeah. Would you just say like creating a nurturing environment for that to be released from within. Because in interpersonal dynamics, whether it's within our family or friends or lover, it's like these repressed emotions that we haven't dealt with are a pebble in our shoe that kind of make us shittier versions of ourselves constantly. And until we can like have, I guess, the safe space to like take off the shoe and take out the pebble,
Yeah.
which could be through therapy or psychedelics and a lot of the modalities that
Yeah.
you suggest.
Yeah. Or even just awareness.
Yeah.
If I'm aware that anger is rising within me, well, then if I can be an observer of it and hold it myself, not that I shouldn't experience it, is that I should experience it, but I don't necessarily have to act it out on somebody else.
Yeah.
Well, that's a question of self-awareness, mindfulness, physical practices. A lot of the martial arts are not about killing others. It's about being present to yourself.
Since you brought it up, there's this beautiful part in the book where you, towards the end, page 412, you go into before the body says no, a self-inquiry exercise, right?
Yeah.
These different questions that you suggest people explore in order to gain access more and more to their true selves. And oftentimes we've created a life for ourselves by virtue of an inauthentic version of ourselves.
Yeah.
And in the pursuit of creating an authentic reality, we first have to discover who we authentically are. And so I'll share these 5 questions and then we can.
Sure. Let me just preface it by saying that this relates to a book that I mentioned in the beginning called When the Body Says No, which I pointed out that the people who develop autoimmune disease and malignancy, as I said earlier, are people that don't know how to say no.
Yeah.
They're the very nice people who take on everybody else's stuff and they don't know how to say no to the world. The body says no for them in the form of illness. And if they can learn from that, there's a lot of healing that's possible. Now, in this chapter, we're trying to say to people, well, do you want to wait to get sick? Or do you want to learn to say no before your body has to say it for you? So that's the intent for this chapter.
Right. Which is, I think, a beautiful invitation for all the listeners. Like, it's not ideal, obviously, to wait until we have cancer to like realize we have to deal with our shit. But to allow these questions to be a process of self-inquiry.
Yeah.
Question 1, in my life's important areas, what am I not saying no to? Question number 2, how does my inability to say no impact my life?
So let's take an example.
Yeah.
I arrive here in LA. I call you up, Andre, do you want to go for coffee or tea, whatever? But you've been up all night helping a friend and you're tired. You don't feel like going for coffee. But you don't want to displease me. You want to be a nice guy. And you come for coffee. It's a very trivial example. Yeah. What happens to you afterwards? What do you feel afterwards? What's the impact?
I'm going to feel like I abandoned myself. And that's, I guess, maybe too much language for it. But
but you'll have some sense of self-betrayal, yeah? Physically, what's the impact? Fatigue? Tired, yeah, of course.
Yeah.
So this little word no, if you don't say it, there's a lot of impact.
Yeah.
So we're inviting people in this example to, what is the impact when you don't say no? I'm talking about a no that wants to be said and you don't say it. You know?
Yeah, absolutely.
So, yeah.
And I think that's also just an important thing for the listeners, that anybody, you don't ever want somebody to be in your space out of obligation. Like, you know, I don't want somebody to come help me move because they feel like they have to, only because they genuinely want to, right?
That's
and that goes into so many different things. All right. Question number 3. What body signals have I been overlooking? What symptoms have I been ignoring that could be warning signs? Where do I pay conscious attention?
Yeah. So here's the thing. People might feel tired, or they might have difficulty sleeping, anxious, they might have dry mouth, back spasms, stomach aches, frequent colds, fatigue, of course. And they go to the doctor saying, headaches.
Yeah.
They go to the doctor, get rid of these symptoms for me. I'm suggesting, well, nobody wants to live with headaches. I understand the desire to escape them, but you might want to ask yourself, is my body talking to me?
Yeah.
Is my body saying no somewhere where I'm not? So these bodies, so do a bit of an inventory. How have I felt this week? And if there are noticeable physical signals, see them as signals. Don't just dismiss them as symptoms that you want to get rid of.
Yeah.
Maybe look into what the message is.
That's so powerful just because oftentimes we have something that happens within ourselves and we think it's something wrong with us, but instead you're inviting to look at it as a signal as our
Yeah,
bodies are so intelligent
absolutely.
that it's there for a reason. So thank you for the headache because there's something that is going on within me that if I didn't
Yeah,
have the headache would have a uglier manifestation down the road.
that's right.
So question number 4 is what is the hidden story behind my inability to say no?
Okay, so I come to LA, I call you up, do we have coffee? You've been up all night, you don't feel like it, but you don't say no. What's the story? Why don't you say no? If I say no, then
Then my friend might not like me.
yeah,
What does that mean about who I am as a friend?
yeah, I'm selfish.
Yeah, all the meaning.
So that's what I mean. What's the story that you're telling yourself why you're not saying no?
Yeah.
So, and by the way, if a friend doesn't like you for not having coffee, what kind of a friend are they anyway?
Yeah.
But you know, but if being liked is a big value to you, because you weren't, then oh, they won't like me. I better not be myself because if I'm, you know, so what's the story? What's the hidden belief? You know, and by the way, is it really selfish to say no when I've been up all night? Is that really what selfishness is about? No, not exactly.
Yeah. So good. And then, yeah, the question 5 is just deeper inquiry, right? Where did I learn these stories? And we've been speaking to that.
And the origin is childhood.
Right.
So there's some childhood programming going on. At some point I learned that if I say no, that's selfish. Somewhere I learned that if I say no authentically, they won't like me. And I was desperate to be liked, to be accepted. So I learned how not to say no.
It's powerful. In the book you shared Jamie Lee Curtis's quote, in this society, there's a genocide of authenticity.
Is that in the book?
Maybe it's not. Maybe I got it from somewhere else.
I was going to put it in there.
Okay.
But then I thought I've quoted her because she said it, and I think it's a wonderful quote.
Yeah.
But we ended up not putting it in the book.
Okay.
I thought maybe because it's a bit too harsh a word, you know.
Well, yeah. I think if anyone could say it, maybe you can. But regardless, that's a very powerful pointer to, like we were speaking to, our inability to say no. We're going to develop friendships, relationships in our external reality based off of the inauthentic version of ourselves that we hold on to so dearly, right? And then coming back into discovering who we are, going through this process, reclaiming our authentic selves. Oftentimes, there will be a crumbling of our world and the relationships that were attached to the inauthentic version of ourselves.
That's right.
So what words of advice do you have for people that are maybe going through that or will be going through that as they claim more of their authentic self, because there is a kind of perceived death of sorts that is happening when you're releasing who you're not?
Well, if you start asserting your own true emotions and saying no where there's a no that wants to be said, some people in your life who you've trained to see you in a certain way will not like it. And so we talk about this tension between attachment, you know, belonging, being accepted, and authenticity. As a child, you had no choice. Whenever it came to a tussle between attachment and authenticity, you had to choose the attachment, give up the authenticity. Now, as an adult, if you start choosing authenticity, you say in a marriage, that's really not working for you. And your partner is just not willing to look at themselves in any way at all, or to work on it. Well, as you grow and as you change, you become more authentic, they're not going to like it. Now you have a decision to make. Do I still choose the attachment and suppress the authenticity? Or do I choose the authenticity at the risk of losing the attachment? What it comes down to is not whether you're going to be in pain or not, because you are. Which kind of pain would you rather be in? You want to choose the pain of self-suppression or the choose of the loss of certain attachments? I can almost guarantee it, that as you choose yourself and the authenticity, you'll have new attachments that are higher level, more respectful, more authentic, more meaningful, more fulfilling, but not right away. In the beginning, there might be an estrangement and alienation. There's somebody at the event that you and I participated in last night, whose story I know, who was sexually abused as a child by their grandfather. In fact, they have a book coming out. In fact, I can mention it. The book is called Glimmer. When she got in touch with that and she began to talk about it, a lot of her family renounced her and came in to go through the pain of the loss of attachment figures in her life. But not being authentic was killing her.
Yeah.
So It's a question of which pain would you rather have? The pain of suppressing yourself, because believe me, it's going to cause pain, or the pain of losing some attachments.
Mm.
That's the choice you have.
It's like either you choose pain or you keep letting pain choose you.
Well, exactly. That's exactly what it is. Now, eventually that pain will heal.
Yeah.
But you're going to have to go through that process, which is why so many people are afraid of going through it.
Speaking of processes, you give in the section on kind of healing, coming back into wholeness within ourselves, you give the 4 A's, which I think are a good process to coming back into that authentic self.
Yeah.
Which I'll share and we can riff on as well.
Sure.
Like pulling these little nuggets. So the 4 A's and 5 compassion, some healing principles. Number 1, first A, is authenticity. We spoke to this, right? By definition, striving for some idealized self-image is incompatible with being authentically who one is.
Yeah.
And the lack of authenticity, as we spoke to, makes itself known through tension or anxiety, irritability or regret, depression or fatigue. The second A is agency. And agency is a capacity to freely take responsibility for our existence, exercising responsibility in all essential decisions that affect our lives to every extent possible. We talked about the alternative, which is being asleep early on.
Or being passive.
Being passive, the hypnotic passivity. The third A is anger, and the fourth A is acceptance. And you share that anger's core message is a concise and potent no, said as forcefully as the moment demands. Very important. And acceptance, beginning with allowing things as they are, however they are, before we can try to integrate it and embrace it and move on. So
and to tell you the truth, we missed out an A that should have been in there, which is called awareness. Because awareness is kind of the ground for all the other 4, and some of you missed putting. We weren't aware enough to put awareness in there. So the reader will have to forgive us for that. But yeah, and those things are essential for health.
Yeah, beautiful. And the awareness, like you spoke to, that's just so crucial to even begin the process or have the desire to.
Yeah.
You give a really beautiful distinction as to. I mean, I've studied Eastern philosophy, quite a bit, and like that's the type of, I guess, text that I most enjoy reading. And in Eastern philosophy, there's not a whole lot of talk of creativity from my perspective. And I love the framework you give on how sensitivity is tied to our creativity, because creativity is such a big part of why we're here. We are creative beings. We use our life force energy to bring things forth from the unmanifest to the manifest. And oftentimes our sensitivity can be viewed as something that is hindering instead of a superpower. And so how do you view the relationship between the two?
Well, sensitivity is simply a trait that people tend to be born with. It's probably significantly genetically determined. And the more sensitive you are, the word sensitivity itself comes from the Latin word for feeling. The sensere means to feel. So the more sensitive you are, the more you feel. Now, the more you feel, of course, the more you absorb and sense and get in tune with the environment, which is what artists do. Poets, artists, actors, creators of, sculptors, actors, dancers. It's like they have these antennae out that just pull in energies, which really promotes what you call the superpower of creativity. But that same sensitivity also makes them more susceptible to pain, because the same touch that would be experienced as trivial by somebody less sensitive really might hurt the sensitive person. So when you get sensitivity combined with trauma or stress, you get a lot more need to protect yourself. Hence the high rate of addiction amongst, say, actors and musicians. Because they're the sensitive people, they're hurting more.
Yeah.
They have more of a need to escape from their addictions. And you get one Hollywood story after another of some big star divulging their addiction so that same sensitive temperament in a supportive, loving environment, just becomes a wonderful, creative leader, joyful, intuitive person. But in an unsupportive environment, they become more distorted, more hurt, more defensive. The creativity doesn't go away, but the creativity starts to serve the personality. And so you look at all these great artists and actors and musicians who their creativity was so amazing that it leads them to stardom. But on a personal level, they just die, and sometimes literally they die. And there's so many examples of it.
Yeah, it's like the sensitivity is almost like if we were to have a piano, and from all the way to the end to the top is like the full spectrum.
Yeah.
The more sensitive we are, the more we have access to within the spectrum of like the human experience.
Exactly.
So it's a beautiful thing to have access to the full piano, to the full spectrum of our emotions, to this human experience. But I think, you know, that invitation that you're sharing is to not have it just serve your personality, but to allow it be an expression from your soul.
Exactly.
And not just our conditioning.
Exactly.
Yeah.
In the book, we give the example of Aretha Franklin, by the way, who there's a wonderful documentary about her where she gives a concert. I think here in LA, maybe in a church here when she was quite young, and she's just channeling God. I mean, that's the only way you can put it, you know, and that's just coming through her. And then she's got this song R-E-S-P-C-T, Respect, which is kind of an anthem of the women's movement. And she herself was not respected at all. She was an abused child and an abused woman. She had great creativity, incredible talent, but she was hobbled from being her true self in her personal life. And I think that contributed to the illness that killed her.
The more that you grow on your journey and the vast amount of experience that you've garnered in your life, do you see a divine design within our wounding? For example, nature is obviously intelligent. It doesn't necessarily have to be a higher power and a god and some guy sitting on the clouds, but nature's intelligence is almost, in ways, it feels like, is giving us our wounding so that we can strategically move through what we need to move through to gain true access to ourselves. And so through your experience working with so many people, on the other side of our challenge is our gift. So how do you feel like the link is there? And do you feel like there is that kind of divine design within our wounding and how it shows up and the purpose it serves?
So the Greek playwright Aeschylus has in one of his plays the statement that the master, Zeus, created us so that we have to suffer into truth. So when you talk about divine design, I just think, I don't want to go to the question of divinity, but there's something about our nature that there's a kind of intelligence in it that wants us to be authentic to ourselves. Not just us, any creature in the world, a plant, an animal, anything. And there's a wonderful spiritual teacher and psychological theorist called A.H. Almaas, A-L-M-A-A-S, from whom I've learned a lot. And he writes the following. He says, your conflicts, all the difficult things, the problematic situations in your life are not chance or haphazard. They are actually yours. They're specifically yours, designed for you by a part of you that loves you more than anything else. The part of you that loves you more than anything else has created roadblocks to lead you to yourself. You are not going in the right direction unless there's something pricking you on the side telling you, look here, this way. That part of you loves you so much that it doesn't want you to lose the chance. It will go to extreme measures to wake you up. It'll make you suffer greatly if you don't listen. What else can it do? That's its purpose. Now, this may seem harsh coming from a medical doctor, but physical illness is often an opportunity for people to wake up. I don't wish it on anybody. I've just seen it function that way. So we have a chapter called Diseases Teacher, a dreadful gift, Diseases Teacher. And I've talked to so many people who told me that the illness was the best thing that ever happened to them. And strangely enough, this is even true when I was working in palliative care, ministering to dying people. And somebody would say to me, no, not everybody, but it would happen on occasion, that somebody would say, Doc, I don't know how to express this exactly, but this disease, even though it's killing me, is the best thing that ever happened to me. Because it called me back to myself. And I learned what's important in life and what isn't. Now, I don't wish that on anyone.
Yeah.
But it's certainly true that there's something in our inner intelligence that's going to make us suffer if we stray away from ourselves. And so for a lot of people, disease has been a huge wake-up call. And they've used it that way. And when you study these people, they're so much more happier, so much more fulfilled, so much more present for whatever remains to them of life than they were before. And many of them will say, I'll never trade this disease for anything. You know. And some, of course, even recover if they take that process deep enough and if they have the strength and the capacity to do so. But they do look upon the illness as some kind of a gift.
Yeah, it's like the switch between asking why is life treating me this way to what is life trying to reveal to me.
Yeah.
And that's just a powerful reframe and maybe difficult to hear right when you hear the news of a diagnosis or something that you don't want to, wish on somebody. But ultimately, billions of years of evolution have gotten us to this point where the intelligence of nature is so widespread, prevalent, omniscient, omnipotent, and there's no way around it. And we are nature.
Well, that's the whole point.
Contrary to the definition of it, funny enough.
Yeah, we are. And just to assure you, if you came to me with an inflamed wrist, I wouldn't begin to talk to you about what stresses in your life and how you. I deal with your inflammation first, but at some point, that inquiry is so helpful to people,
right?
At the appropriate time,
right? And it might be the only way out, right? Because like if you could go through 3 rounds of chemotherapy and all the ways and through the medical system for trying to heal a cancer, but until you reconcile what is truly at the root, right?
No,
what would you say?
I wouldn't say that. People are cured of cancer.
No, of course.
Without doing that work.
I'm just saying there are certain cases, right, where, for example, unless they heal and reconcile the deeper emotional traumas, they might not be able to be healed through just Western medicine, right? Would you say that?
Well, this is where I make a decision between cure and heal. You can be cured in the sense that the disease will go away. It doesn't mean you're healed.
Yeah.
Healing means becoming whole.
Yeah.
So illness can be an opportunity to become whole, to really heal. But the reality of Western medicine is that it's largely helpless in the face of most chronic conditions. Like we don't know autoimmune conditions like lupus and rheumatoid arthritis, multiple sclerosis, a whole range of them. We can mitigate the symptoms and usually look for deterioration and see that as the prognosis.
Yeah.
So now, when it comes to acute conditions and some cancers, Western medicine is brilliant, and people can be brought back from the brink of death, or certainly from the brink of debility. But for most chronic conditions of mind and body, we're rather poor at really helping people heal. We just don't have the mindset and the capacity to do so.
Yeah, whether it's the ignorance or the arrogance, like you spoke to earlier.
Yeah.
Why is it essential to be vulnerable to heal?
Well, it's not that it's essential to be vulnerable to be healed, because everybody's vulnerable. Vulnerable simply, it's a Latin word. It means to wound. And vulnerability is the capacity to be wounded. Now, I assure you, we're all totally vulnerable from conception until death. There's no such thing as a human being who's not vulnerable. There's just a lot of human beings who don't want to recognize their vulnerability. So to reframe your question, it's not why is it essential to be vulnerable? We all are.
Just to recognize it.
Why is it essential to come to terms with it, to accept it?
Yeah.
Because nothing in nature grows without vulnerability. So I gave this example in the book. A tree doesn't grow where it's hard and thick. It goes where it's soft and green and vulnerable. Take a crustacean animal like a crab. It can't grow inside its shell. When it's hard, it can't grow. It needs to molt and become very soft and vulnerable. So growth and vulnerability go along together. That's why children are so vulnerable, you know. And why is it essential? Because only through vulnerability can we grow. And our denial or a denial of and escape from our vulnerability keeps us stuck, hardened, keeps us really rigid. We can't grow. We can't heal. And you see this in veterans all the time. These men who are programmed into a kind of toxic masculinity.
Yeah.
Where killing and accepting being killed are just, that's okay, you know. Then they go through their PTSD treatment and they say, oh my God, I'm vulnerable. I can hurt. I can accept those emotions. I don't have to deny them. I don't have to be this tough guy all the time. You know, so that post-traumatic growth that happens always happens through embracing people's vulnerability. You know.
And then how do you propose people be the most effective and efficient advocate for healing, right? Because oftentimes as we gain awareness and we start to go on the path of healing within ourselves, we then see all the ways in which the people and circumstances around us are not healed. And we can fall into the trap of trying to change people into becoming healed. So
yeah. Well, the first thing is not to be an evangelist. And Almas, who I just quoted, he said once, I think he's the one who said that, protect us from the people that want to save the world, you know?
Yeah.
So if you find yourself filled with evangelic fervor, look a bit deeper inside.
Yeah.
What is it that you're trying to do by trying to save the world? That's on the one hand. On the other hand, when I was working with severely addicted people in Vancouver, they would say to me very authentically, Doc, if I ever get out of this, I'm going to spend the rest of my life working to make sure that nobody else has to go through this. So there is as soon as there's healing and a movement towards wholeness, there's a genuine movement towards wanting to heal others.
Yeah.
So that should not be dismissed or derided. It should be honored. But the question is, what's driving it? So I'm telling you, whenever there's an evangelical fervor where you need somebody to heal, where you need to heal others, but it's a need, then you better watch it.
Yeah.
And you do some more healing yourself. You
Yeah.
know, so that's the distinction I'd make.
Yeah. My friend Peter Crone always says that there's none so self-righteous as the newly converted.
Well, exactly.
Yeah.
And I've been through that a number of times.
Yeah.
But there's a new insight, a new impression, a new wisdom, you might even say, in a way where you want to inflict it on everybody, you know?
Yeah, totally.
And, and nobody can stand it.
Yeah. But it is that natural tendency, I guess, or inclination of light to spread light, right? It's for awareness to spread awareness. And once we have that growth within ourselves, oftentimes we'll probably want to unconsciously enforce that on other people. But then the deeper desire there is to just expand what wants to expand, which is healing.
Well, take you on a light analogy. Try pushing light. It can't be done.
Yeah.
You can shed it. So that desire to push it on others is some unresolved problem that you still haven't dealt with.
Yeah.
And, you know, again, I've been through that.
Yeah. Powerful. Be the light. All right, cool. Last couple very quick questions.
Yeah.
One, thank you so much for this, by the way. And everybody who's been tuning in and loving this conversation, let us know in the comment section below and check out The Myth of Normal, link in the description if you haven't already. I highly recommend you purchase it. It's very transformative. What is it like to be 78?
I'm trying to remember. That was 3 weeks ago. I'm 79
Oh,
now.
wow. What is it like to be 79? Happy birthday.
Thank you. What's it like to be anything? Look, this is a sort of a line I've often evoked. You know, so I'm 79 now, and I wouldn't wish to be as young and stupid as I was when I was 78. You know, so I am aware of it is possible to grow old, which doesn't mean to get more decrepit. It means to grow as you're getting old. It's possible to do that, and I hope I hope and pray I can stay on that path. You know. I know that I know more now and I understand more now, accept more now, see more now, can suffragate more now than I ever could. So in that sense, it's very comfortable. On the other hand, I don't swim as fast as I did 3 years ago or 5 years ago, you know? So that's something to be accepted. So what's it like? So far, I like it. You know, it's not the 79 aspect that I like. It's just having a bit more access to myself. That's what I like.
Hmm. What advice do you have for young lads like me who want and see their trajectory of hopefully growing old and being maybe 100 one day, and up until that point, trying to do healing work and transformative work, much like of what you're doing? What advice do you have for individuals like myself that are on similar paths and trying to spread the light and awareness?
What advice would you have?
For myself?
Yeah, just reverse your question. What advice would you have?
My advice, I guess, for myself in that position would be to continue to stay true to myself and to unravel the gifts that I feel like have uniquely been given to me.
Okay, so my advice is that you don't need my advice.
Great. What for you? What do you feel like for you has been your single-handedly biggest lesson in this life, if you had to pick one?
When you say to people, who do you think you are? That's a really good question. Depending on how it's asked, because you're not who you think you are.
Mm.
If I just know that.
Do you feel like you know yourself?
I'm getting there. I've often said this, you may have heard it, but I've written my epitaph. Do you know what my epitaph is going to be?
Mm.
It's going to be carved on my gravestone. It's going to say, it was a lot more work than I had anticipated. So it's just ongoing work. That's all it is.
Yeah.
But that's not a negative thing.
No.
It's a good thing. It's a glorious thing.
Yeah. Beautiful. What is the strongest memory you have of your life, if you had to pick one?
Strongest memory. What do you mean strongest memory?
Strongest emotional attachment, I guess, you have to a memory that sticks out. When you look over Dr. Gabor Maté's life and you see his history, what stands out as potentially the most impactful memory?
I just don't think I can give you an authentic answer to that. Nothing.
No worries.
But if I allow the question to percolate in me, it's, you know, who comes up is my wife. It's a relationship that I'm in and have been for 55 years. That's the strongest emotional resonance. Yeah.
If you had to put in a succinct way what your wish for humanity is.
Oh, freedom. People need freedom. They need freedom to be themselves. Freedom. If I actually did a workshop here in LA, I participated in it maybe 5-6 years ago, and the theme was, "What is your calling?" And by calling, I didn't mean what profession you choose. What calls you? And when you leave the earth, or when you return to the earth, what would you have wanted to have contributed? So I really got that my calling is that people are free. And so this book, it's all about liberating people, or helping people liberate themselves, put it that way. Freedom politically, freedom economically, freedom socially, freedom from their unconscious emotions, so they can be themselves. I think that's my desire for human beings, is freedom. You know, and that's, I think, the essential endeavor of all the great work that has been done in the world, is the desire for freedom.
You certainly are doing that. I know personally within my life, and a lot of the people that have been students of your work, how much freedom there is on the other side of this gained awareness and everything that we've been talking to today. So your work is very much so doing that. Thank you so much for the work that you're doing and for coming on today for the second time. I really appreciate it. And here to support any way that I can. Is there any last words that you have for the audience, for anything that you want to share?
Well, you've already said it, but, you know, if I may be self-serving for
Please.
a moment, I just really want people to be aware of this book of mine,
Yeah.
The Myth of Normal. I think it